Dealings with the Dead, number 47. I am rather surprised to find how little is known among the rising generation about slavery in the Old Bay State. One might delve for a 12-month and not gather together the half of all that is condensed in Dr. Belknap's replies to Judge Tucker's inquiries, Mass. H.C. 491. And what does Mass is Massachusetts, or what's that stand for? I never was a sexton in the Berry Street Church, but I knew Dr. Jeremy Belknap well in 1797 when he lived on the southeasterly side of Lincoln Street near Essex. He died the following year. His garden was overrun with spiders. I had a great veneration for the doctor. He gave me a copy of his Foresters, and to repay a small part of the debt, I was proceeding one summer morning with a strong arm to demolish the spiders when he pleasantly called to me to desist, saying that he preferred them to the flies. Slavery was here. Negro slavery at a very early day. Jocelyn speaks of 3 slaves in the family of Maverick on Noddle's Island, October 2nd, 1639, MHC 23, 231. These were probably brought directly from Africa. In 1645, the General Court of Massachusetts ordered Mr. Williams at Pascataqua, over which Massachusetts exercised jurisdiction, to send the Negro he had of Captain Smith to them, that he might be sent home, as Smith had confessed that the Negroes he brought were stolen from Guinea. Same source, 495. In the same year, a law was passed against the traffic in slaves. Those accepted who were taken in war are cast into servitude for crime. Same source. And those 2 exceptions really should be the only things, the only sources for slaves. There are other restrictions, but that's for elsewhere. The slave trade was carried on in Massachusetts to a very small extent. In 1703, says Dr. Belknap, a duty of, is it 4 pounds or liras or whatever, was laid on every Negro imported. He adds, by the inquiries which I have made of our oldest merchants now living, I cannot find that more than 3 ships in a year belonging to this port were ever employed in the African trade. The rum distilled here was the mainspring of this traffic. Very few whole cargoes ever came to this port. One gentleman says he remembers 2 or 3. I remember one, between 30 and 40 years ago, which consisted almost wholly of children. At Rhode Island, the rum distillery and the African trade were prosecuted to a greater extent than in Boston. I believe no other seaport in Massachusetts had any concern in the slave business. Same source, page 196. Dr. Belknap drew up his answers to Judge Tucker's inquiries, April 21st, 1795. Between 30 and 40 years ago, therefore, was between 1755 and 1765. Dr. Belknap remembered the arrival in Boston of a whole cargo of slaves, almost wholly children, between the years 1755 and 1765. If we have ever had an accurate and a careful narrator of matters of fact in New England, that man was Jeremy Belknap. The last of these years, 1765, was the memorable year of the Swamp Act and the Liberty Tree. Let us hope the arrival was near to 1755. About the time of the Stamp Act, says Dr. Belknap, this trade began to decline, and in 1788 it was prohibited by law. This could not have been done previous to the Revolution, as the governors sent hither from England, it is said, were instructed not to consent to any acts made for that purpose. Same source, 197. In 1767, a bill was brought into the House of Representatives to prevent the unnatural and unwarrantable custom of enslaving mankind and the importation of slaves into the province, but it came to nothing. Had it passed both houses in any form whatever, says Dr. B., same source, page 202, Governor Bernard would not have consented to it. One scarcely knows which most to admire, the fury against the South of gentlemen whose ancestors imported cargoes of slaves, or bought and sold them at retail, or the righteous indignation of Great Britain, who instructed her colonial governors to veto every attempt of the Massachusetts legislature to abolish the traffic in human flesh. The disposition existed at an earlier period to abolish the brutal traffic. In a letter to the Reverend Dr. Freeman from Timothy Pickering, which may be found in MHC 1883, he refers to the following transcript from the records of the Selectmen of Boston, 1701, May 26th. The representatives are desired to promote the encouraging the bringing of white servants and to put a period to Negroes being slaves. A few only of our merchants, says Dr. B. M. H. C. 497, were engaged in this traffic. It was never supported by popular opinion. A degree of infamy was attached to the characters of those who were employed in it. Several of them, in their last hours, bitterly lamented their concern in it. Chief Justice Samuel Sewall wrote a pamphlet against it. Many, says Dr. B., who were wholly opposed to the traffic, would yet buy a slave when brought here on the ground that it was better for him to be brought up in a Christian land. For this, Abraham and the patriarchs were vouched in, of course, as supporters. Well, because Christianity didn't exist at that time, right? But the Bible does have stuff supporting slavery of other tribes and stuff, so, yeah. I wouldn't blame it on Abraham and those people, but, it's in the Bible. Our winters were unfavorable to unacclimated Negroes. White laborers were therefore preferred to black. Negro children, says Dr. B., same source, page 200, were reckoned an encumbrance in a family, when weaned, were given away like puppies. They have been publicly advertised in the newspapers to be given away. In answer to the question how slavery had been abolished in Massachusetts, Dr. Belknap answered, by public opinion. He considers that slavery came to an end in our Commonwealth in 1783. After 1781, there were certainly very few who had the brass to offer Negroes for sale openly in the newspapers of Boston. Public opinion, as Dr. Belknap says, was accomplishing this work, and every calm, impartial person may open for himself how patiently we of the North should have endured at that time even a modium of the galling abuse of which such profluvium is daily administered to the people of the South. It seems to me that such rough treatment would have been more likely to addle then to hatch the ovum of public opinion in 1783, the Common Era. Dr. Belknap's account, same source, page 203, is very clear. He says the present Constitution of Massachusetts was established in 1780. The first article of the Declaration of Rights asserts that all men are born free and equal. This was inserted not merely as a moral or political truth, but with a particular view to establish the liberation of the Negroes on a general principle, and so it was understood by the people at large, but some doubted whether this were sufficient. Many of the blacks, taking advantage of the public opinion and of this general assertion in the Bill of Rights, axed their freedom and obtained it. Others took it without leave. Some of the aged and infirm thought it most prudent to continue in the families where they had been well used, and experience was proven that they acted right. In 1781, at the court in Worcester County, an indictment was found against a white man for assaulting, beating, and imprisoning a black. He was tried at the Supreme Judicial Court in 1783. His defense was that the black was his slave, and that the beating and so on was a necessary restraint and correction of the master. This was answered by citing the aforesaid clause in the Declaration of Rights. The judge and jury were of the opinion that he had no right to beat or imprison the Negro. He was found guilty and fined 40 shillings. This decision was a mortal wound to slavery in Massachusetts. The reader will perceive that a distinction was maintained between the slave trade, economy, and the holding of slaves, inseparably connected as it was with the incidents of sale and transfer from man to man in towns and villages. He who was engaged in the trade, so-called, was supposed per se or per alium to steal the slaves, but contrary to the proverb, the receiver was, in this case, not accounted so bad as the thief. The prohibition of the traffic in 1788 grew out of the public indignation produced by the act of one Avery from Connecticut, who decoyed 3 black men on board his vessel under the pretense of employing them, and while they were at work below, proceeded to sea, having previously cleared for Martinico. The knowledge of this outrage produced a great sensation. Governor Hancock and M.L. Tombe, the French consul, wrote in favor of the kidnapped Negroes to all the West India Islands. A petition was presented by the legislature from the members of the Association of the Boston Clergy, another from the blacks, and one at that very time from the Quakers was lying on the table for an act against equipping and insuring vessels engaged in the traffic and against kidnappers. Such an act was passed March 26, 1788. The poor Negroes carried off by that arch-villain Avery were offered for sale in the island of St. Bartholomew. They told their story publicly, Magna est veritas. The governor heard and believed it. The sale was forbidden. An inhabitant of the island, a Mr. Atherton, of blessed memory, became the protector and gave bonds for their good behavior for 6 months. Letters confirming their story arrived, and they were sent on their way home rejoicing, and arrived in Boston on the following 29th day of July. In 1763, according to Dr. Belknap, same source, 198, there was 1 black to every 45 whites in Massachusetts in 1776, 1 to every 65 in 1784, 1 to every 80. The whole number in the latter year, 4,377 blacks, 354,133 whites. It appears by census taken by order of government in the last month of 1754 and the first month of 1755 that there were then in the province of Massachusetts Bay 2,717 Negro slaves of and over 16 years of age. Of these, 989 belonged to Boston. This table may be found in MHC 1895.